Tyler, let's take a seat. All right, guys. So one of the things that we've covered so far is finding the missing side lengths of special right triangles. So we had the 45, 45, 90 and the 30, 60, 90 right triangle. Now for the 45, 45, 90, the sides opposite the 45 degrees are going to be the same. We call them the legs. And the hypotenuse for a 45, 45, 90 is whatever the length of the leg is times the square root of 2. So when we went over this here, if we were given one of the sides opposite the 45, we would take that leg value and multiply it by the square root of 2 to get to the hypotenuse. And that would give us the hypotenuse every single time. Now the other setup is that they gave us the hypotenuse first. And if we're given the hypotenuse, we divide it by the square root of 2 to get back to the length of the legs. Guys. So on a 45, 45, 90, if we're given one of the two legs, the other leg is going to be the same length. And to get the hypotenuse, we take whatever that length is and multiply it by the square root of 2 to get to the hypotenuse. Now if we're given the hypotenuse, the side opposite 90 degrees, we divide it by the square root of 2 to get what the legs are. Now in the 30, 60, 90, the small side was opposite the 30 degrees. The long side was opposite the 60 degrees. And the hypotenuse was opposite the right angle. And there were three different setups that we had for the 30, 60, 90. So if we're given a 30, 60, 90 degree right triangle, the first setup is that we are given the short side length. We're given the side opposite the 30 degree angle. So if we're given the length of the short side, the side opposite 30, to get the long side, the side opposite 60 degrees, is we take whatever the short side is and multiply it by the square root of 3. And to get to the hypotenuse, we take the short side length and multiply it by 2. So whenever we're given the short side length of a 30, 60, 90 degree right triangle, we multiply it by 2 to get the hypotenuse, and take that length and multiply it by the square root of 3 to get the long side, the side opposite the 60 degrees. The other setup that we had is that we were given the long side length first. So in the setup, they gave us the side length opposite the 60 degrees. And the first thing we have to do is figure out what the short side length is. Now to be able to find the short side length is we take the longs measure and divide it by the square root of 3 to figure out what the short side length is. And to find the hypotenuse, we take that value of the short side length and multiply it by 2, because we're already given the long. Short side length times 2. And the last setup that we had is that they gave us the hypotenuse. And if we're given the hypotenuse, the first thing we need to find is the short side length. And to find that, we take the hypotenuse and divide it by 2. And once we have the short side, to find the long side length, we take the short side length's measure and multiply it by the square root of 3. And even with all of these here, with the 30, 60, 90 right triangle, we're either multiplying the short side by 2 and then multiplying the short side by the square root of 3, or we're given the long side length, so we divide by the square root of 3 and then multiply the short side length by 2, or we're given the hypotenuse, which we divide the hypotenuse by 2 to figure out what the short side length is, and then multiply that by the square root of 3. In the 45, 45, 90, if we're given one of the legs, one of the sides opposite 45 degrees, well, the other is going to be the same. And we multiply it by the square root of 2 to get to the hypotenuse. And on a 45, 45, 90, if we're given the hypotenuse, we divide it by the square root of 2 to get back to the legs. So we look at this first one here. Now we're wanting to find the value of x and y. Were we given one of the legs to start with or the hypotenuse? The legs. And we know that because why? It's opposite the 45 degrees. We know it's a 45, 45, 90 because we do have two 45-degree angles and a right angle. So we know that the sides opposite the 45 degrees are going to be the same, which tells me that the value of y is 8. What do we need to do to find the value of x? So we take the legs and multiply it by the square root of 2, which would be 8 times square root of 2, which is 8 square root of 2. That's it. Because the sides opposite the 45 degrees are going to be the same, and the hypotenuse is going to be whatever that value is times square root of 2. Any questions on this first one here? Let's look at the next one. So what kind of triangle do we have here? (45, 45, 90). Even though we weren't given the other angle, we were given only two. Well, if one of the angles is 90 and the other is 45, the third one has to be 45 for these three angles to add up to be 180. Now, what side lengths were we given? 14, which is opposite the 45 degrees. So which variable do we know for sure? 14 is which one? Because it's opposite the 45 degrees, because the sides opposite the 45 degrees are going to be the same. And the hypotenuse is going to be the length of the legs times the square root of 2. Well, what's the length of the leg? Well, 14. And 14 times square root of 2 is 14. So y in this case is 14 square root of 2. And that's it. Questions on this here? Be ready for the next one. So looking at this triangle here, are we looking at a 45, 45, 90 or 30, 60, 90? Because we have a 90-degree angle and a 45, so this one up here has to be 45. Well, 10 is opposite which angle? The 45 degrees, so it means it's one of the legs. And which other variable do we know for sure? X, because it's also opposite the 45, which makes x equal to 10. Because the sides opposite the 45 degrees are going to be the same. And the hypotenuse is going to be whatever that value is, the leg, times the square root of 2. Well, the legs are both 10, so we take 10 times square root of 2, which is 10 square root of 2, because we don't have another radical to multiply it with. So the hypotenuse for this here would be 10 square root of 2. And that's it. Any questions on any of this here? Let's look at the next one here. Well, if one of the angles is 45, the other has to be 45. So we're looking at a 45, 45, 90. Now, what do we know about the values of x and y? Because they're both opposite the, which makes 4 square root of 2 the what? Hypotenuse, yes. Now, on the last ones, to go from the legs to the hypotenuse, we multiply by the square root of 2. So this time we're going to divide, because we're going to take the hypotenuse and divide it by the square root of 2. Well, in this case, we have 4 square root of 2 divided by the square root of 2, which would be, so the value of x and y are both 4. Because to go from the legs to the hypotenuse, we're multiplying by the square root of 2. So to go from the hypotenuse to the legs, we are dividing. Questions on this here? So what can we say about this one here? Yes. Exactly. Because 45, 45, 90, and x and y are going to both be opposite the 45 degrees. And 15 square root of 2 is opposite the right angle, so that automatically makes it the hypotenuse. And to find the legs for 45, 45, 90, we take the hypotenuse and divide it by the square root of 2. Well, the hypotenuse in this case is 15 square root of 2, and we divide it by the square root of 2, which would give us 15. Because these two square root of 2's would cancel. And we could plug it into the calculator and it would actually tell us that it's 15. So x and y in this case would both be 15 and 15. Any questions on this here? Let's go on and look at the next one. So again, we still have another 45, 45, 90. And what side length did they give us? The hypotenuse. They gave us the side opposite 90. Well, to find its length, we're going to take the hypotenuse, which is 7 square root of 2, over 2, and divide it by what? The square root of 2. And this one here is the first one where it wasn't completely obvious what it was, because all the rest of them, just square root of 2 divided by the square root of 2 is 1. So we could type it in here. So 7 second square root of 2 over 2. And we're dividing this by second square root of 2, which tells us that it's 7 halves. Now we could have typed this in as 7 second square root 2 over 2, and we could have hit the fraction again and done second square root of 2 and got the exact same thing. But we do need to make sure that the 7 square root of 2 over 2 is in the numerator completely if we do it that way. So that tells us that this is 7 halves. So the value of x is 7 over 2 and y is 7 over 2, because the sides opposite x and y, or the angles opposite our side lengths x and y are both 45, so those two would be the exact same. Any questions on this here? Well, we know this one here has to be 45, which tells us that the value of x and y are the same. And how would we find it? So how would we find it? So if I want to find the length of the leg,
you've got to divide it by, or times it by square root of 2. Divide it by square root of 2.
because to go from the legs to the hypotenuse, we multiply by the square root of 2. To go from the hypotenuse to the leg, we divide by the square root of 2. So the hypotenuse is 18. So we're going to divide 18 by the square root of 2. 18 over second square root of 2, which should give us 9 square root of 2. So if we want to get to the hypotenuse, we multiply by the square root of 2 for 45, 45, 90. If we're given the hypotenuse on a 45, 45, 90, we divide by the square root of 2. Any questions on this here? So again, we're given the hypotenuse of 8. And whenever we're given the hypotenuse on a 45, 45, 90, we divide by the square root of 2. And when we divide 8 by the square root of 2, we would get 4 square root of 2. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah, because then you're talking about a different root, because you can change the root. Because square roots are understood to be 2, because we could have a cubed root. So the number that goes inside of it would be a 3.
I was just wondering about that when we started talking about
Yeah, because we would write a cubed root as this here. So your cubed roots is finding a number that multiplied by itself 3 times. Quartic, fifth, and then fifth root, sixth roots. All right, guys, let's look at this one here. This is the last of the 45, 45, 90 that we'll look at. Now, this time they did give us the hypotenuse, which is 7. So it means that the values of x and y are going to be the same. Now, to find it, we take the hypotenuse and divide it by the square root of 2. And if we take 7 and divide it by the square root of 2, we get what? 7 over. So with the 45, 45, 90, if we're given one of the legs, one of the sides opposite 45, the other is going to be the same. And the hypotenuse is whatever that value is times the square root of 2. Whenever we're given the hypotenuse, we divide by the square root of 2 to get the 2 legs. Questions on this here? Let's look at the next one. Now, looking at this one here, this would be a 30, 60, 90. And the reason we know it's a 30, 60, 90 is, well, they gave us a right angle and an angle of 60 degrees. So the other has to be 30. Now, when we look at these here, guys, we need to determine what side we're given. So 8 is opposite which angle?
30 is the short side.
So that means this is the short side length. So we need to find the hypotenuse and the long side. The hypotenuse is the side opposite 90. The long side is the side opposite the 60. And the hypotenuse is going to be the short side times 2. And the long side is going to be the short side length times the square root of 3. So here, how long is the short side length? So the hypotenuse is going to be 8 times 2, which is? Now, which variable is the hypotenuse? Because it's going to be the side length opposite the 90 degrees. So for the long side, we'll have 8 times the square root of 3, which is 8 square root of 3. And this would be x. Because going from the short to the long, we multiply by the square root of 3. And from going from the short to the hypotenuse, we multiply by 2. Questions on this here? Let's look at the next one. So they gave us 1/2, which is opposite which angle? Which makes the 1/2 the?
The short side. So that means y is, so x is your hypotenuse. So
So x would be the hypotenuse because it's opposite the 90 degrees. And y would be the long side because it's opposite the 60 degrees. Now to get the hypotenuse, we take the short side and multiply by 2. And to get the long side, we take the short amount and multiply by the square root of 3. Now in both of these here, the short side length is what? 1/2. So 1/2 times 2 would be,
1
which would be our x, our hypotenuse. Now the short side length again is 1/2, so we're going to take 1/2 times the square root of 3. Which would be square root of 3 over 2, which is our y value. Because to go from the short to the hypotenuse, we multiply by 2. And to go from the short side to the side opposite 60, the long leg, we multiply by the square root of 3. So what side are we given? Because it's opposite the 30 degrees. So this here is the short side length. Now to find the hypotenuse, we take the short side length of and do what to it?
multiply it by 2.
And 14 times 2 would be?
48.
And that would be our x or y?
The x. The y is going to be 14 square root of 3.
Exactly. Now the long side length, the side opposite 60, is going to be our short length of 14, and we're going to multiply it by square root of 3, which exactly would be 14. Guys. And this would be the value of y, the long leg. Questions on this here? We're getting a seating chart tomorrow. Because while I'm up here talking, we're going to stay talking about this here. So when we look at this one here, the side opposite 30 is the short leg, which is our 12 square root of 5. So to find the hypotenuse, we're going to take this amount and do what to it? We're going to multiply it by 2. So we're going to take 12 square root of 5 and multiply this by 2. So if we take the 12 square root of 5 and multiply it by 2, we get 24 square root of 5, because the square root of 5 is not going to be multiplied by 2, but we're going to multiply it by the 12, because they are both whole numbers, and get 24 square root of 5, and that would be our hypotenuse. Now to find the long leg, we take the short and multiply it by the square root of 3. Because this time, because they are both square roots, we multiply what's inside the roots together. So the 5 times 3, which would give us 15. And tell us that the long leg is 12 square root of 15. So the two missing sides for this here are 12 square root of 15 and 24 square root of 5. Any questions on this here? Let's go on and look at the next one. Here, this time we're not given the short leg, but we're given which one? The long leg. And we know that because it's opposite the 60 degrees. So the first thing we need to find is the short leg. And we're going to take the length of the long leg and do what to it? Divide it by the square root of 3. Which would be 3 in this case, because the square root of 3 and the square root of 3 would cancel, telling us that the short leg is 3. Now from here we need to find the hypotenuse. We'll take the short leg and multiply it by 2. And that's it. So whenever we're given the side opposite 60, we divide it by the square root of 3 to get to the short side length, multiply it by 2 to get to the hypotenuse. And that's all we need to do for this here. Questions on this one here? Let's look at the next one. Now 12 square root of 3 would be the long leg, and it's not because it has the square root of 3, but because it's opposite the what? 60 degrees. So to get back to the short side length, we need to take our 12 square root of 3 and do what? Divide it by the square root of 3. And well, again, these would cancel, giving us, so the short side length is now to get back to the hypotenuse, we take the short side length and multiply by 2, which gives us 24. So whenever we're given the side opposite 60 degrees to start with, we divide by the square root of 3 and then multiply by 2 to get to the hypotenuse. So we get these values here. Questions on these here? So what would we need to do for this one here? So we divide 15 square root of 3 by the square root of 3. So the short side length for this here is 15. And 15 times 2 is? And again, the long leg is going to be the side opposite 60 degrees. It's not going to be the side that has the square root of 3. Because that's what we need to be looking at more than what the number is. What side is it opposite? Will tell us what we need to do. So if we're given the side opposite 60 degrees, we need to divide it by the square root of 3 to get to the short length, multiply by 2 to get to the hypotenuse. Questions on this here? And again, this time we're given the side opposite 60 degrees, so we need to take the 12 and do what? Divide by? Now this one here, we don't have square root of 3 on top and bottom to just cancel out. But we can still type it in. Go 12 over second square root of 3. And we get 4 square root of 3. So this here is 4 square root of 3, which would be our side opposite the 30 degrees. And to find the hypotenuse, we take 4 square root of 3 and multiply it by. Now the 4 and 2 would multiply together to give us. And those would be our answers. Questions on this here? Now again, we're given the side opposite the 60 degrees. So we're going to take the 8 and do what? Divide by the square root of 3. If we type this in, 8 over second square root of 3, we actually get 8 square root of 3 over 3. And this here would be the short leg, the side opposite 30 degrees. And to get the hypotenuse, we take the short side length and do what? Times it by 2, which would give us 16 square root of 3 over 3. And we could have also typed that into the calculator. Any questions on this here? Now that brings us to the last, or we're going to move on to the last type here. And the last type is if we're given the hypotenuse. We did skip one. Because we did skip the one that had 9 as the side opposite 60. Yes. Now this time we're given what side length to start with? Because it's the side opposite 90. So to get back to the short side length, which would be exactly 6 divided by 2. And 6 divided by 2 is? So the short side length is? Short times the square root of 3, which would be 3 times, well, that's just 3 square root of 3. So once we're given the hypotenuse, we divide by 2 and take that number and multiply it by the square root of 3. And that's it. So these here would be our 2 answers. Questions on this here? So this one here, again, they gave us 16, which is the side opposite the 90, which makes it the hypotenuse. So the first thing we would do is take 60 and do what? 2, which would 8. So we divide the hypotenuse by 2 to get to the short side length, which would be 8. To get to the long side, we take the short side and multiply it by the square root of 3, which would be the long leg. And that's it. So if we're given the hypotenuse, we divide by 2 to get to the short side, multiply by the square root of 3 to get to the long. Questions on this here? So here, side opposite 90 is 11. So to get to the short side, we need 2. Take 11 and divide it by 2. We leave it as a fraction, so it would be 11 halves. Now to get to the long side, we take 11 halves and multiply it by square root of 3, which would be any questions over any of these here? And I believe that is the last one. Now there's not an assignment attached directly to this one here, but we did have an assignment already for 45, 45, 90, the worksheet, and a worksheet over the 30, 60, 90 last week. So we do have those there. And tomorrow is a, what? Quiz over these here, the 30, 60, 90, and the 45, 45, 90. So tomorrow is a quiz over these here.